Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts. I'm very excited to be here with Katherine Howe, who's going to be talking about her book. I actually have to look this up because it's such an awesome name. Um, a True Account, Hannah Masury's Sojourn Amongst the Pirates, written by herself. I mean, what an amazing title. So
It's a mouthful.
it is a mouthful, but it's a worthwhile mouthful because it's so enticing to read. So before we get to Katherine, I just want to say a couple things. I want to say thanks to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library who support all of our programming. We couldn't do all this fun stuff without them. And I'd like to thank Katherine for allowing us to share this program with other libraries, 14 of which jumped onto it because they also thought it was enticing and interesting. And so as for anybody who knows me, I think that when libraries work together, we make magic. So today we'll have pirate magic with Katherine. So the interesting thing about Katherine, well, wait a minute, let me go back a second. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A. There's a button at the bottom of your screen. If you just want to chat with each other, just do that in the chat. And you can buy signed books by Katherine from Aesop's Fable, our very favorite indie bookstore. And of course, you can always get them from the library. I just saw our copy going out today, so it might not be available, but I think you can find it at many, many libraries in the area. Okay, so I think the interesting thing about Katherine, not only did she write this book, she also co-wrote a book with Anderson Cooper,
Ooh.
but she lives in Salem and she's
Oh.
descended from three women who were tried for witchcraft. So this story has probably been a long time in the making. Tell us more about yourself, Katherine. Welcome to Ashland.
Thank you,
And
Mina.
how exciting is this book to be out in the world?
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And also thank you so much to the Ashland Public Library and all the other libraries who've joined because libraries make our literary life. And so I'm delighted to be here. And also thank you, Aesop's Fable, who I've worked with before. They are wonderful. And I will also hasten to add that wherever you happen to be coming from, if you have an independent bookstore in your town, they can order this book for you if you want. So it's not just Easton's Table. I'm actually I'm zooming to you from Marblehead, which is right next door to Salem, one town over from Salem. Although it was legally part of Salem for the first however many decades of its existence. So I guess that's on a technicality I get on Salem. But what's funny is that although people tend to assume that that I'm a New Englander, maybe because of what I write about, or possibly because I don't know if I have like a New Englandy affect, perhaps. I'm not actually a native New Englander. It's tragic to say, I'm a Texan. I'm a stranger in this land. I'm a Texan. My family, my dad's family was from New England, but they left in the 1930s and they moved down to Houston, which is where I was born and which is where my parents were both born and where my father is still living. Although my mother at one point figured out, she sat down like messing around with ancestry and she discovered that I think with the exception of my father, there's been a Howe living in Essex County for like 400 years. So because we moved away and then I moved back.
Uh-huh.
And so all we need to do is have my dad come out. Like, how long do you think my dad has to stay with me for it to count? Like, does he have to change his voter registration or can he just like stay for a month or something? But what happened was I started writing fiction. I moved to the Boston area in way back in 2001 to come to graduate school at Boston University, where I was doing doctoral work in American and New England studies. And I had a background in art history. I'd worked in museums before graduate school, and I studied art history as an undergraduate. And I was interested in visual culture. I was interested in the ways that images and then also objects, also material culture, do cultural work. And so that's what I was doing in graduate school. And I was studying for my oral exam, and we moved to Marblehead, my husband and I, really on a whim. We'd been living in Harvard Square, and we burned out, and we fled to the North Shore basically because of a listing we happened to see on Craigslist. Like I'd never visited Marblehead before. I had no idea what a special place it was. And when we rolled up in our tiny beat up little car, we rolled up to this house that was built in 1705. And I felt like I was stepping into a magical fairyland. For those of you who don't know, Houston, which is where I'm from, is a new South city. It's huge. It is there are many advantages to it. It's really diverse. The food is amazing. It has its own unique music and culture. And and it's a special and interesting place, but it could not be more different architecturally, culturally than Essex County, Massachusetts, and specifically Marblehead, Massachusetts. And so we moved into this apartment. At the time, it's not an apartment anymore, on the second floor of a house built in 1705. And I started studying for my qualifying exams, which is like the midway point of a doctoral humanities doctorate. And of course, Marblehead is right close to Salem. And what was fascinating to me was, I started thinking about how so many of us first encounter the Salem story through fiction. Most of us first encounter it through the Crucible, usually in high school.
I think
And
mine was The Witch of Blackbird Pond.
yeah, or The Witch of Blackbird Pond, that's also a good one. Or even Esther Forbes, who I
Mm.
love. One of my favorite books of all time is Johnny Tremaine, and Esther Forbes wrote a Salem story for young adults, I think in the 1940s.
Mhm.
But I think most of us first come to the Salem story through fiction,
Right.
one way or another. And I was struck, of course, we know what Salem's like today. It's so much fun. It's Halloween Central. It's a great place to go and have a good time. But it's not necessarily easy to learn about the history of what happened there because there's not much architecturally that remains from, first period architecture, things like that. So if you're curious about learning about life in early New England, and specifically what was going on with the Salem witch crisis, it's kind of hard to get that story, I think. And I was struck by the fact that in the fictional versions of Salem, I felt like we don't have a version, or at the time, I felt like we didn't have a version of the story that actually took Puritan beliefs and worldviews seriously. I felt like most of the fiction treated people living in that time period with condescension, especially
Mm.
Arthur Miller. I felt like Arthur Miller had a very condescending attitude towards the kind of cultural hysteria or group hysteria. That's not really a word that we use anymore. So I felt like the representation of witchcraft at Salem in particular went one of two ways in popular culture. Either it went in the condescending direction, which faulted people who lived in the 17th century for somehow not having a 20th or 21st century worldview, which I think isn't really fair.
Mm-hmm.
Or it went in a cute direction, like a Harry Potter or like practical magic or sort of a like empowerment, charming, like it wasn't scary.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like I hadn't seen a version of the story that took their worldview seriously. And that worldview did include belief in folk versions of magic, and it did include beliefs in the reality of witchcraft as an actual threat.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think part of it too, and I've in the years since writing my first novel is called The Physic Book of Deliverance Dane and came out in 2009. And it's set in Marblehead, Massachusetts. And it's about a graduate student, surprise, surprise, who discovers that one of the Salem witches was the real thing, but she's the real thing the way the colonists believed witches to be. And I wrote it in a magical realist style, which felt very organic to me at the time. And upon reflection, it occurs to me it's because of arguably from the region that I'm from, because I'm from the Gulf Coast. I'm from this region that is culturally at an intersection point between Southern folktale and Tejano and Mexican magical realism. So
Mm-hmm.
it just felt like the right way to tell that story. And I felt like I hadn't seen a version of that story before. And so Physic Book came out while I was in graduate school. And then I very quickly discovered that I was better at being a historical fiction author than I was at being a grad student. And so I've been writing fiction and in some instances popular history ever since.
Mm-hmm.
And so the latest novel is a true account, Hannah Masury's Sojourn Amongst the Pirates, written by herself, which so I've written in a few different time periods in a few different ways, but a true account. I was so my only hobby. I only have one hobby. I'm so boring. I can't cook. I don't knit. I hate crafts. I don't do anything. The only hobby that I have is I'm a sailor. And so, Marblehead is a sailing town, and I had sailed as a child in the Gulf Coast and rediscovered my love for it once we moved to coastal Massachusetts. And I've continued to sail since we arrived here. And so, like most sailors, I'm romantic about, the age of sail and fall premature novel, all of that stuff. I love all of that stuff. And it seemed very natural for me to want to write a pirate story. But as I started doing more research towards a true account, I was interested by the fact that it actually dovetails in many interesting ways with a Salem story. Because if you think about it, first of all, the periods are the same. The periods overlap.
Hmm.
The so-called Golden Age of Piracy stretched from around call it the 16 teens to 1726. And in fact, the action in a true account opens in Boston in 1726 at a real life pirate hanging that really happened of a guy
Mm.
named William Fly, which I can tell you about momentarily. But William Fly's trial and hanging was overseen by Cotton Mather, the same guy who oversaw the Salem witch crisis.
Hmm.
And also, if you think about it, most people who were tried as witches were women, but not all of them.
Hmm.
Most people who were tried as pirates were men, but not all of them. And in each case, they are populations of people who are economically marginalized or disadvantaged. And in each case, the choices that they've made or what they're accused of doing represents a challenge to authority. And in each case, their execution is made a public spectacle.
Hmm.
And so I was thinking a lot about the ways that my interest in pirates is actually very closely bound up with my interest in witches. And I've noticed over the last 15 years of my career that I'm very, maybe it's because I'm an Americanist, but I'm very motivated by stories of people who would not have typically left much record of themselves in the archive. I'm not going to be your person for Regency romance or for Tudor court intrigue. I'm not that interested. I'm interested in stories that are invisible in the archive.
Hmm.
And I
And I
take it.
think that that's certainly something that people are very, very interested in now. In terms of research, digging those gems, finding the stories that have never been not been told for whatever reason.
Right.
Um, so when you were writing this, oh, I wanted to say one thing is we have had two programs with the Salem Witch Museum,
Okay.
and it really digging into what was happening with the Salem witch trials. It's been
Yeah.
fascinating. We have another one coming up in July.
Over the
Um,
past decade and change, the Salem Witch Museum has done a really good job, I think, of moving in that direction, which has been really, I've done events with them in the past as well. And I think increasingly they're committed to that, which I think is great.
Right. So where did your interest in witches and pirates come in? Because your graduate degree was sort of more in the cultural history of the world. And
Mm.
why focus in on this?
Well, it wasn't the world, it was American. So
American.
American studies is like interdisciplinary history. And in my instance, the interdisciplinarity came about from it being interested in history and art history or in
Mm.
visual culture. And so I think it just came about because I was predominantly working in the 20th century, but I had a secondary interest in the early colonial period for whatever reason. And that's where my interest happened to take me,
Hmm.
funnily enough. Although I've written in other periods as well. I've written a book that my husband relentlessly mocked as the great American abolitionist anarchist ghost story the world's been waiting for, which was set in the 1820s, but also in the 21st century, and it's called The Appearance of Annie Van Sinderen, and which I think was read by like 9 people, maybe 12. I don't know, but I'm very proud of that book all the same. I've written a few different periods. I've written in the Gilded Age, I've written in New York, and I've written in New England. Strangely, I've not yet published a novel set in Texas, which is where I'm from. I have written a novel set in Texas that is a failure. It's in the drawer, and it is actually my first pirate novel. I wrote a pirate novel for a couple of years in the 20 teens. I worked very hard on it. I got deep in the weeds on that book. And maybe because it was about home, I was trying to pack too much in. Like,
Mm.
like I have a funny relationship with New England, as it is a place where I was raised by my grandmother to regard it as the homeland.
Hmm.
But and yet I am a stranger here. I don't have the kind of like roots that you have if you stay in a place where you grew up.
Hmm.
And so I have this kind of twin consciousness relationship with New England in that way.
Well, Marty says they have Annie's book, so they must be one of the 9 or 12. And you know what?
Thank you,
The thing is, like,
Marty.
if you can birth a book, you've been successful. It doesn't in some ways doesn't matter how many people
No, I know,
read it.
but I just laugh about it because the other thing that's funny about Annie Van Sinderen is it's definitely my most memed book. Like weird quotes from that book show up in memes all the time. And one point I was riding in a taxi cab in Manhattan, and I don't know if you know this, but in New York they have they called NYC Link kiosks. They're these kiosks that have like little like news or directions or what have you. You can charge your phone. Well, I was riding in a taxi cab one day a couple of years ago, and a quote from Annie Van Sinderen came up on it. I was like, what the heck? And I hadn't even known that they were going to do that. So it's weirdly referenced a lot more than most of my other novels, and yet nobody reads it. It's very funny.
Well, you're definitely entering the consciousness of New Yorkers for sure. I just want to remind people that this is a Q&A, so feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. I have plenty of questions, so no worries there. But so let's talk about Hannah Masury a little bit, though, because that is your most recent book. What nugget did you find in researching anything that brought you to her?
This was a funny one. Forgive me for continuing to hydrate. So a few years ago, I'd written my first pirate novel that didn't work. But I knew I wanted to write about pirates, and I wasn't ready to let it go. Pity my poor agent, who's so tired of my pirate phase. I'm sure she would love me to do anything else but pirates, but I've been thinking about pirates for a long time now. So a few years ago, I don't know if this is a universal experience, but my parents went through the great downsizing. And so I received the great shipment of all the stuff. So I was going through the shipment of stuff, and I came upon a punch bowl. It's beautiful, and I love punch. I don't know about you. I love punch. I have a great punch recipe. My husband and I love to throw a party where we have this punch. This punch has become notorious amongst our group of friends. So my first thought was, aha, punch bowl. Tragically, it's too fragile, I think, to use for any of our parties. But it has on its side a beautiful rendering of a square-rigged ship. And there was some inscription on the punch bowl, like just enough that you could kind of make it out. But I had no information about what the backstory of this was, why I had it, where it came from, whose it had been, anything like that. So I started to do a little research. And it turns out that the punch bowl was given to a guy who was like a distant great uncle named Edward Howe, when he became the master of a clipper ship called the Ellen Southard. This was in the middle part of the 19th century, so near the end of the Age of Sail. The Age of Sail ends in 1868, officially with the opening of the Suez Canal. That's when you can have larger, slower boats. You don't need the really fast sailing ships anymore. So this is kind of near the end of that period. He's named the master of this large sailing vessel that was built in Bath, Maine. And so fortunately, we live in this moment now where so many primary sources are digitized. I managed to do all this research in about an afternoon and uncover the story that I'm about to tell you, which was incredible. So Edward was in his early 30s. He got married. He married a girl who lived across the street, who was also in a seafaring family. Her name was Hannah Augusta Masury. And as sometimes happened in this time period, she left with him on their voyage. It was not that unusual for a captain's wife to come along. So they left Beverly, which is where they lived, in the Ellen Southard and carrying a load of locomotives, because this is just before the east and west halves of the railroad had met in the middle. And so they're building the railroads in California. They needed locomotives. They're going to bring it locomotives. They have to go around the Horn all the way to California. It takes them 207 days of sailing to get this load of locomotives down. It takes them 50 days to get around the Horn.
Wow.
And so, as I say, as a sailor, I'm reading this and already I'm impressed. Like you're 50 days hard upwind sailing in the roaring 40s, trying to get around the Horn with a load of locomotives. Already my mind is a little bit blown. They make it around the Horn. They go up the coast. They drop the locomotives off in California. Then they go across the Pacific down to Sydney. They pick up some passengers in Sydney, Australia. They go back up to Hong Kong, drop the passengers off, and then they pick up a load of laborers, Chinese laborers, who are going to travel over to California and work probably on the railroads. Well, they are partways across the Pacific when Edward dies, leaving Hannah, 33 years old, in charge of the ship. Now, some time passes and they start to run out of fresh water. And then the crew and the passengers stage a mutiny, Hannah holds them off with a pistol, signals her distress by hanging their flag upside down off the stern of the boat, and she is rescued eventually off the coast of California.
Wow.
And just like my mind is completely blown by this. Then I love this part. She sues for Edward's percentage of the proceeds of the voyage. She takes the money back to Beverly, buys herself a house, remarries a dentist, lives quietly, and then dies in 1910. And I loved so much about this. I mean, obviously there's so many things that I loved about this story. One of my favorite things that I loved about this story was trying to imagine like walking down the street of Beverly, Massachusetts in 1909 and passing like a little old like wiry New England matron, having no idea that she's been around the horn with a load of locomotives and put down a mutiny. It's crazy. And so then, because I'm a little, I have my ridiculous moments. I looked up where her house was, and I discovered there's a little Mexican restaurant on Washington Street, and I think it's Cabot Street in Beverly. I'm a Texan. I need a lot of Mexican food just to like carry on. And I discovered that I was in the habit, whenever I would go to Beverly for Mexican food, of parking in front of her house.
Oh.
And so I thought, okay. And as far as I could tell, I couldn't find any suggestion that Hannah had had any children. And so, because I can be sentimental in moments, I looked up, she's buried in Beverly Central Cemetery. And one day I went and called on her and I just said, listen, I just want you to know that I know what you did. And that was crazy. And it didn't seem like enough to make a novel, but it just filled me with such joy and delight that I knew that I needed to name my protagonist of my pirate novel, Hannah Masury. And also because in the course of the story, you know, Hannah, my fictional Hannah, acquires a piratey name. And the piratey version of her name is, people keep mishearing her last name as Misery.
Oh.
Hannah Misery, which I thought was kind of great. So that is the origin point for the fictional Hannah Masury. But of course, the fictional Hannah Masury is a teenage girl. She's in her late teens. She's working at Ship Tavern in Boston, which was a real place, and which in 1726 was already almost 100 years old.
Wow.
She's been bound out to service there. It doesn't exist anymore, tragically, but it was already quite old. She's been bound out to service. She is one of these people who, she's fictional, but she is one of these people who would have been invisible to historians looking back at the early part of the 18th century. She attends William Fly's hanging. And I liked imagining how someone living Hannah's life would have felt watching William Fly's hanging, which I can explain why in a moment, because William Fly does something pretty remarkable on the scaffold. But Hannah gets caught up in some intrigue, has to disguise herself, and then goes off, gets caught up in a pirate crew. And that part of her story was inspired somewhat by the true-ish stories of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who were two working class women who ended up disguised as men and in the crew of a guy named Calico Jack Rackham. And they were captured as pirates in 1716 off the coast of Port Royal, Jamaica. So there is some historical precedent. And in fiction, there are many fictional historical precedents too, of women disguised as men and going pirating. And so Hannah is part of, my fictional Hannah is part of this rather storied tradition of women in disguise on the high seas.
So you had said that you were going to talk a little bit about Cotton Mather in that same instance. So can you talk a little bit about what was going on with that hanging?
Yes. So William Fly was a mariner on a ship called the Elizabeth. And he and his crewmates were subject to what they called hard usage. We don't know exactly what that means, but it was abusive enough, whatever it was, that William Fly and a couple of his Confederates murdered the sailing master, threw him overboard, and seized control of the ship. They renamed the ship Thames Revenge, and then they went pirating off Cape Hatteras. This is a time period when piracy was punishable by death. So it gives you a sense of how extreme their circumstances were. These were men who had nothing to lose whatsoever. And the tricky thing is, though, that the skill set necessary to make a ship sail in 1726 is different from the skill set necessary to navigate. 1726. Navigation was actually a very specific skill set. And in fact, most of the coastal communities, Marblehead, Beverly, Salem, all of these places would have had navigation schools just for the boys who were then going to make their careers at sea. So William Fly and his Confederates they kidnapped a fisherman because they were going to make him be their navigator. They wanted him to navigate them up to Martha's Vineyard, where they felt like they could put in for food and water, and then they could just continue their raiding as long as they could. Well, the fisherman, as you can imagine, didn't fancy being kidnapped into a life of piracy. And so he tricked them. He didn't take them to Martha's Vineyard after all, but he took them. And as someone who sails around Massachusetts now, I'm impressed that he got away with it. He took them all the way outside Cape Cod, and they ended up getting waylaid outside of Boston. And it's because the fishermen knew that piracy was being increasingly policed, essentially, and that he had a good chance of being redeemed and the pirates would be captured. And that's exactly what happened. The pirates were captured. They were publicly tried. They were forced to go and listen to Cotton Mather sermonize at them because it was in the interest of, and Boston in the 1720s is, to my mind, a fascinating moment. We're sort of just post-Puritan. You have the generation that saw the Salem witch trials. Many of them are still around, but we're also edging our way into the Enlightenment. We're edging our way into the consumer revolution of the 1730s. So the world is different in the 1720s. People are a little better off. People are thinking a little bit differently, religiously, culturally, spiritually, however you want to define it. And so, as an aside, I'll mention that it was a fun project to try to think about Hannah and Hannah's relationship. So she uses a lot of Puritan sounding rhetoric because she's been forced to go to meeting, and so she's been exposed to all this stuff, but her belief system is actually very different from the generation before.
So is this the real Hannah, or is this your fictional Hannah?
Sorry, from here on out, I'll be talking about the fictional Hannah.
Okay, got it.
Hannah, fictional Hannah in 1726.
Okay.
So William Fly and the guys who are going to hang with him are, Cotton Mather takes it upon himself to bring them back to the Lord, because it is in authority's interest, and authority in this instance means religious authority, but also, public authority in general. It's in authority's interest to make these guys break so that no one is tempted to do what they've done. And most of the time it works. Sorry, I have a little throat tickle that I've been trying to get over for weeks now. It hasn't been going away. So the day for their execution comes. They've been going to church. Everyone in town has been coming to stare at them. I mean, the idea of a hanging as public spectacle, I think, would horrify most of our sensibilities today. But at that time, it was a very common thing. People would come from the countryside and make a day of it to watch people be hanged in public. When they're led up to the scaffold, the guys that William Fly is going to hang with are all blubbering. They're begging for mercy. They're bemoaning their fates. They're speaking out to the assembled populace that they're sorry. They should never have been drinkers. They should never have gone whoring. They regret it all. They regret everything. They regret it bitterly. They hope they'll be saved. Well, William Fly does two things that I find pretty impressive. Thing number one, when he gets onto the scaffold, he looks at the noose. Remember, he's a sailor. He looks at the noose and then he says to the hangman, "Don't you know your trade?" He unties the noose, reties it better, and puts it around his own neck. Thing number two that he does is, when it is his turn to confess all his sins and subjugate himself before God and everyone, all he says, his last words are, "Masters of vessels, do it well by your men, lest they be put upon doing as I have done."
How does that translate to? It sounds...
That means ship captains, don't mistreat your sailors, or they're going to do exactly what I've done. He's not sorry at all. He's not sorry. In fact, it's a threat. It's a threat saying, "I'm not sorry. I'd do it again. And if you mistreat your sailors, they'll do it too." And then he dies. And it's just like, whoa. And so, but because it is so important to order, civic order and maritime trade, that William Fly be brought to heel, it is not enough to just hang him. Instead, after he's hanged, his body is gibbeted. And that means that his body is taken to a rock in not Marblehead Harbor, in Boston Harbor, called Nix's Mate. And his body is hung there in chains and left to rot. And it's, I don't know how long he was hanging there. But it is a little mind-blowing to me to think about that happening in 1726, and only 100 years later, a generation and a half, people are riding out in steamboats to go to Nahant on summer excursions. It's another world. It's another world.
Mm-hmm.
And so my fictional Hannah is in the audience when William Fly does these things. Mm-hmm. And my fictional Hannah is someone who has no power at all. She's unlettered. She has no money. She has no family. She has no prospects. And she sees someone who is in even more dire straits than she is, who refuses to bend before authority. And it's this moment that glimmers to life in Hannah, the idea that she can take what she wants if she so chooses.
And she does, right? I mean, she dresses as a cabin boy,
right,
and sails the shining seas, right?
She does. She does. I managed to avoid, I think there's some worry that it would have gotten too technical. I don't go as technical in all the sailing jargon as you get in Master and Commander novels, for instance. And it's partly because Hannah is naive. She doesn't know how to sail when she gets on the ship. And so there's a lot of her not understanding what's going on. But we see her obtain a degree of mastery the longer that she's there, and the more that she does. And she ends up changed. And then there's another trick to the story. So the reason that the novel, a true account, Hannah Masury's Sojourn amongst the Pirates, written by herself, is so long, is not just because I'm stubborn and irritating and like long titles. Not only for that reason. That is one of the reasons, as you gather from the title of my first novel, which is called The Physic Book of Deliverance Dane, which is impossible to remember. It's called that because about 42 pages in, so the book is written initially in first person. You feel like you're just sort of caught up in the action. You're along in Hannah's story. Then all of a sudden, there's a rather abrupt transition where you realize, oh wait, I've been reading over someone's shoulder this whole time. And so the book is called A True Account, Hannah Masury's Sojourn Amongst the Pirates, written by herself, because that is the title, the name of the manuscript that an academic named Marion Beresford has been brought by one of her students. And that's whose shoulder we've been reading over. Mm-hmm. Because in the early part of the 18th century, it was at the beginning of the novel as form. So a lot of publications at that time had these kind of long-winded titles. Like even the novel Tom Jones, the full title of Tom Jones is something like the story of Tom Jones, a foundling. It's longer than you would think. And so I gave it that title because I was trying to replicate, to some degree, the sensation of reading an 18th century text. Mm-hmm. So there are moments in Hannah's part of the story where there are obvious curse words that have been blanked out. And that's because in 18th century texts, any curses and often many names are blanked out. Mm-hmm. And so it was my way of trying to make the sensation of reading a primary source from that period.
So let me just go back for 1 second, because I want to understand the structure of your book. Is basically in the 1800s. Is it Meredith?
So it's 1726 is Hannah's story, and it winds up being 1929 into 1930 is Marion.
Marion, right? So Marion has found a manuscript that Hannah wrote.
Marion is a professor at Radcliffe, and one of her undergrads, whose name is Kay, comes to her with this manuscript. Okay. And there is a suggestion in the manuscript that Hannah might have left some treasure behind, and that they might be able to find it, because you can't have a pirate novel and not have a treasure hunt, obviously. Right. There's also a parrot, I must say.
There has to be a parrot.
There has to be a parrot. There's definitely a parrot. It's a red macaw, which is a gesture. Actually, in my novel from 2012, I have a blue macaw, so I think I must like macaws for some reason. So part of the question that this book is asking is, something that I think about a lot as someone who is trained as a historian and who writes fiction. The title is A True Account, but the question is the account actually true? Can something be true emotionally without being factually true? Because of course we're reading a story about a woman who never existed. What does it mean to care and become emotionally invested in someone who is imaginary? And so a true account is also engaging with some of those kinds of questions as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to get some more water?
I think, well, I'll tell you what, in all honesty, I'm almost out of water, but I do have a little wine. So I think I'm okay.
I think you
We
will
can
be.
press on.
Okay, so Bruce asks, why did you make Marian gay? What purpose does that serve? Doesn't she have enough of a burden being a woman in academia in the 1930s and being overshadowed by her famous father?
Um, it's not that I made her gay, it's just that that's how she is. I mean, there are gay people
Mm-hmm.
in the world. And sometimes they want to go on treasure hunts. But I'll tell you, part of it was that some of Marian's story came about because, oddly enough, of a chapter that was in the book Astor that I wrote with Anderson Cooper. In that book, we explore not just the Astor family, but also the ways that the word Astor came to mean other things to other people. So Waldorf Astoria, for instance, had its own set of connotations. Pardon me while I slurp a little wine. We have a chapter on the Astor Hotel bar, which from its opening at the very beginning of the of like around 1900 until it closed in 1966 was possibly the most famous meeting place for gay men in the world. It was certainly very famous for gay servicemen, especially during World War II. And so a lot of why it was so successful was because of the codedness of interactions between patrons at the bar.
Mm-hmm.
And that got me thinking a lot about spaces of safety. And one of the big themes in A True Account is the ways that people, in the story, I'm thinking mostly about how women often have to do this, how important it is that women appear a certain way in order to guarantee our safety. So Hannah, it's obvious how Hannah must control how she appears when she is in disguise. But even when we're not in disguise, we're still disguising ourselves to some extent. Marian has to rigidly control how she appears to people. And I was interested in exploring a time period that was different from the one Hannah is living in, but that's also different from the one we're living in now, where Marian is living in a world where gender presentation is actually literally policed, not just socially policed, but policed by the cops.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was thinking about ways that as Marian explores Hannah's story, she sort of takes some of Hannah's character into herself. Like we watch Marian, Marian's transformation is not all that complete, but Marian changes over the course of the story. And some of it has to do with the ways that just as Hannah is inspired by William Fly, Marian is sort of inspired by Hannah.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also interested in, so Hannah also deploys her sexuality in ways that are designed to both ensure her safety, but also to give her pleasure. She lives in a world where she at one point bemoans that she has nothing of her own.
Mm.
And so I was interested in exploring that. It just felt like that's who Marian was.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how Marian had to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's an interesting question, and your very first response was like, that's just who she was. Really resonates with me because I think that people have all kinds of burdens, and then
Yeah,
they happen to be gay, or they
right.
happen to be a person of color, or they happen to be,
Yeah.
this other stuff. So I find that very, very interesting.
Mhm.
Um,
There's also
so
something going on with sort of gender presentation where Hannah has to disguise herself. And Marian, although we never really get into a lot of detail about it, but it is strongly implied that Marian has a kind of gender non-conforming affect, that she is sort of masculine in her affect. Or she has to figure out how to deal with that or how to struggle with that in the 1930s. And so I was interested in that difference, in that parallel and in that difference, because I very often write into timelines, and there are very often echoing themes between the timelines that are not always made explicit, but are nevertheless unfolding at the same time.
So let's talk a little bit about the treasure. What does that mean for Hannah, and what does that mean for Marion?
Well, I don't want to
Yeah,
get into
no
any
spoilers,
spoilers. I
but
don't want to get into any spoilers. I mean, there's something to be said for what what is what is treasured. What are things that we treasure? And I think that we have this very typical idea, Pirates of the Caribbean, stacks of gold and things like that. So much of the reading I did in primary sources about piracy, the what is seized by pirates doesn't align with any of our popular fantasies of what treasure is. It's lumber, it's enslaved people, it's shoes, it's coffee. There ends up being a slightly romantic treasure aspect to it because that's fun, and also because there are many thematic elements in a true account that are nods to Treasure Island. This book is very much in dialogue with Treasure Island. I like to write books in dialogue with other books. My book Conversion is in explicit dialogue, critical dialogue, I should say, with The Crucible, for example. But I don't want to spoil too much, but there is the question of that there's a moment in the story, in the 1930 part of the story, where we learn that one of the characters is in pursuit of something she considers a treasure. That's not what you think, and that is a bit surprising. And so I have some fun with that idea as well.
I read a book once where somebody was considered wealthy because they had spices. It was a time when spices were not easily accessible. So Diane says, pirate is usually a pejorative term. In this case, was it neutral and simply translational commerce, or did the transactions include sex?
Sorry, can you ask that again?
Sure. Pirate is usually a pejorative term. In this case, was it a neutral and simply translational commerce, or did the transactions include sex?
Sex?
Sex.
I'm a little unclear, like what transactions we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. So Diane,
I would happily have some clarification, if and answer that question however we can. I mean, certainly in the 18th century, pirate was a pejorative. Pirates were, although funnily enough, they were also romanticized in this time period as well. I mean, one thing that was interesting, so in April, I have a primary source reader coming out from Penguin Classics called The Penguin Book of Pirates, which contains, and it's an edited volume that I've put together of primary sources. And one thing that I learned, which was surprising and I found fascinating, was that pirates have been romanticized even while pirates were still a going concern in the way that we imagine pirates. So during the so-called Golden Age of Piracy, which was from the kind of early part of the 17th century until, as I said, 1726, there were a couple of generations of pirates. So like Blackbeard, for instance, who's active off the Carolinas in the 17 aughts and tens. He was like the second generation of the Golden Age of the pirate. And the first generation had been widely covered in broadsides and stories. And so guys who grew up and became pirates in the 1710s had heard stories about pirates before them. And in some instances, styled themselves after them. So I'll give you a good example. If anyone, I haven't actually watched Our Flag Means Death because I like to keep my own head in my own story. But Our Flag Means Death on HBO is about a guy named C.D. Bonnet. C.D. Bonnet was a real guy. And what's fascinating to me about C.D. Bonnet is he was a plantation owner. He was an enslaver in Barbados. And unlike someone like William Fly, like most people ended up going into piracy out of extreme circumstances, like William Fly did. C.D. Bonnet was that rare person in the 18th century who had a choice about what he could do for himself. He had money, he had property, he had wealth. C.D. Bonnet decided what he wanted to do was be a pirate. Stevie Bonnet had no maritime experience whatsoever. He had no idea what he was doing. He used his own money to buy a boat, a ship, and kit it out with crew. And then he went off pirating and he ended up hanged for it. But it was because he had this, I know, and he was a Confederate of Blackbeard. And he ended up, but it was partly because he had this fantasy of what being a pirate was like. I'll give you another example. The ship that was the pirate ship Wida, that was wrecked off Cape Cod and has been widely excavated by Barry Clifford, if I'm not mistaken. That belonged to Black Sam Bellamy, or came to belong to Black Sam Bellamy. It was a ship run by enslavers, and then Sam Bellamy took it over, I think in the Bahamas. Well, a few years ago, I read an article in the Boston Globe that they discovered a boy's shoe with a silk stocking and a tibia inside. And supposedly that is because Sam Bellamy had seized a ship and there had been passengers on board, and that one of those passengers was an adolescent boy who wanted to go along and be a pirate. He ended up dying as much as the other pirates did. So even in the moments of time in which piracy was still a going concern, even when it was punishable by death, there's still a romanticism that is attached to it. I think because of the challenge that it poses, the seeming promise of self-determination, and the challenge that it poses to authority. So in answer to maybe to part of Diane's question, it was a pejorative, but it was still subject to romanticization.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I understand it either, but I'm interested in the aspect of commerce there. So pirates, and maybe in Hannah's case too, were they just stealing from other ships? Were they stealing from, or were they truly looking for, I mean, like Hannah sounds like she was looking for treasure, but what were they stealing?
I mean, it depended on what time period you're talking about. So early on, there was raiding of Spanish treasure galleons that were traveling, that were bringing, precious metals and things from Spanish settlements in Central and South America back to Spain. That was in the 1600s. By the time you get later, so for instance, in Texas, where I grew up, there's a guy named Jean Lafitte who has been largely romanticized as a pirate. He was active on Galveston Island in the 18 teens. Now, what Jean Lafitte was doing, so the 18 teens is the time period when importation of enslaved people was no longer permitted in the United States, but owning enslaved people was. So Jean Lafitte was raiding Spanish slave ships, seizing the enslaved people who were cargo, and then laundering them over the Sabine River. So that is the treasure that he was stealing. So it was about raiding of any kind of maritime value and trade, and it just was dependent on where and when you were. But there are also a few in the Penguin Book of Pirates. There are a few instances of people who are more like there's some instances of pirates who were so successful, like raiding in the Mediterranean or raiding in the Red Sea or raiding in the Indian Ocean. There's a pirate enclave off of Madagascar called St. Mary's that raided ships traveling that belonged to the Mughal Empire, and some of the coins seized from some of those raids ended up back in colonial North America, which is astonishing. So there is some instance of like plundering of wealth as it's moving around, but there are also instances of people who are more kind of like highwaymen, but on the sea, of people who attack a ship and just seize food and goods, and then maybe they take the ship because the ship that they're in is full of holes. And so it kind of depends on when and who you're talking about, what the treasure or the commerce in question is.
So let me go back to that question about treasure, because we're almost out of time. In with Hannah and Marion, is the treasure that you were seeking wasn't in the story, was it actually what they wanted?
That's a good question. And there's a conversation that unfolds between Hannah and a character named Sen or Seneca, he's a fictional person, but there are records of self-liberating people who ended up joining pirate crews. And so Seneca is a self-liberating person who ends up turning to piracy because that is what is available to him. Mm-hmm. And Hannah and Sen become kind of allies in a sense. And nominally, what they're looking for is William Fly's treasure, which is kind of like a nod to Treasure Island. They're looking for, in Treasure Island, they're looking for Captain Flint's treasure. Mm-hmm. But at one point, Hannah then says to Sen, "And what do we do when we get it? Do we go live somewhere? What do we do?" And Sen says, "Well, like it's never occurred to him." And he said, well, maybe we go to St. Mary's. But he talks about St. Mary's like it's heaven, like it's not a place that you ever actually intend to go. It's clear that their desperation is their endpoint in a way. And we do end up learning what happens to Hannah and Sen, and I don't want to spoil anything one way or the other, but it is a question that I enjoyed thinking about, like what are they looking for? Is there ever an endpoint to what they're trying to accomplish? And when Hannah is sort of stunned when she discovers, because she thinks that Sen has all the answers, and Sen hasn't let himself get that far. He's not let himself imagine because it seems impossible.
And you had said that Marion also changed, going with this journey. Yeah. Same question, what was she ultimately looking for?
Well, Marion is looking for something different and perhaps less tangible. And I don't want to tell you what Marion ends up with. But she, over the course of she suffers a really devastating setback. And over the course, and then she comes out on the other side of the setback and has come into maybe a fuller sense of her own authority. She has been having this career. Her career is sort of unimpressive, kind of trundling along, but not impressing anyone. She has this very kind of larger than life explorer for a father, and she's been in his shadow. And so what Marion is looking for is I think, like Ben and Hannah, is this kind of self-determination, is the freedom to be in control of what happens in her life.
Awesome. Like I said, we have about 7 more minutes, and I do want to ask you about writing with Anderson Cooper. How does that happen?
He's just as nice as you would think. He's lovely and wonderful. That came about because he wanted to write a history book about the Vanderbilts, and he had written a couple of books before, but writing a history book is a specific skill set, like navigation. And so word went out on the street, as it were, that he needed someone to help him with the kind of archive piece and structuring and things like that. And so I think they talked to a few different people, and since I'd written for a popular audience, but I was coming from a history background, I seemed like a good fit. And then, because when you write a history of the Vanderbilts, or our second book together was about the Astors, there's a way to approach that is just about business history, or just about, intrigue, corporate intrigue, things like that. I was more interested in the cultural, as you can imagine, the cultural side of it. And he was more interested in that as well, which was fun. And so we ended up, both of the books are kind of episodic. They hang around either a particular event or a particular person in the family at kind of a crucial moment in their life. And they were really fun. I really enjoyed both of those books. I'm very happy with both of them.
I was going to say I really liked Vanderbilt. I haven't read the Astors yet, but just because it does really dig into the people, and that you feel like you can get to know them, a story that you would normally never get to dig into at all.
Thank you. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. And then, of course, in the Vanderbilts, because his mom was Gloria Vanderbilt, and so we end up spending more time on the Vanderbilt women to some extent. And after we get a little bit looser, I'm very pleased that in Astor we managed to work in not one but 2 riots. We worked in the Astor Place riot and the draft riots. I'm very satisfied that people think this is a Gilded Age hoity-toity society book, and actually there's riots. Maybe it's my pirate side.
I don't
But I'm
know. I
very
mean, it sounds to me like you're really able to um, take what's happening in those moments or in those moments in time and
mm,
create a story that we can is accessible to us to understand what was happening for people, you know, politically, religiously, economically, all of that within a story that we can read.
well, thank you. I'm delighted that you thought it worked.
I totally think it works. And I think
Thanks.
you also write YA books. And I love YA books because I
Mhm.
think that they are also super accessible. And that's why a lot of adults read them. And
Yeah.
I love
I've
that.
only two YA books, and it's been a little while since I wrote one, but I had fun with those as well.
Yeah, but it's a different way of thinking because you have to make
Yeah.
it um, written in a way that teens would appreciate, but also adults would be like, "Ooh, that's something I want to read about too."
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, my first YA book was Conversion, which is the one that is a clap back at Arthur Miller, and then the second one is my ghost novel, Annie Van Sinderen,
Love it.
which is sort of like a Rashomon ghost story that never uses the word ghost. It's a weird book. It's so weird. I like it a lot.
Well, all those 12 people that read it liked it a lot as well.
That's good.
Um, so a couple more minutes. What are you
Yep.
reading right now? Tell us what you would recommend for us to read.
Right now, I'm reading a Michael Gross book called
Hmm.
Flight of the Wasp. It's because in a couple of weeks I'll be doing an in-person event, kind of about Astor, at the Century Association in New York, and I'll be doing it jointly with him. And so we'll be talking about. He's written a lot in Vanity Fair. He's written a history of the Met Museum, and so we'll be talking about, I guess, like the downfall of the American ruling class, I suppose. I don't know. Maybe he's going to talk about the upfall of the American ruling class, and I'm going to talk about the riots. I don't know. But I'm reading that book in preparation for that. And I'm also starting to read a lot of primary sources in preparation for my next novel.
Which was my
And
next question.
my next novel is it's still in the carrot shopping stage. So I don't have a title or a date or anything like that to share with you, but I'm imagining, because I've been thinking about the Gilded Age, I'm imagining a Bonfire of the Vanities social novel, but set in New York in 1893. Kind of just as Bonfire of the Vanities was like the party is over for go-go 80s New York City. I'm gonna have the party is over for go-go New York in the 1890s. And because one thing I would like to do is, with all love and respect to Julian Fellows, he somehow that's the guy who did Downton Abbey and is doing The Gilded Age on HBO right now. He tends to believe that servants like the people they work for and are invested in them, which I
Mm.
find very strange. And so I want to have a more warts and all picture of what life looked like in Manhattan, in both at the top and at the bottom
Hmm.
in the 1890s.
Well, I do say that if it becomes a movie, I hope it's better than the Bonfire of the Vanities.
Yes, I know. We all do. Well, the other thing that there's been some interest in trying to develop a true account is an animated series for adults.
That would be
So
awesome.
another thing that I'm going to be working on in the coming weeks is some treatment work for that and see if we can move that forward. I think it could be
Well,
pretty fun.
yeah, you and I talked about this before people came in, is I love comics, so I'm all over
Yeah,
that. I'm
yeah.
actually binge watching Avatar: The Last Airbender as we speak.
Ah, wonderful,
Yes.
wonderful.
Catherine, thank you so much for this. This has been
Thank
incredibly
you.
enlightening and interesting.
Well, I had a really good time. But before we go, I just want to say, if anyone wants to keep up with me, my website is katherinehowe.com. I am on Facebook, Goodreads, Twitter, Instagram, all of those things. And also, if anyone happens to be on the North Shore and wants to catch up with me in person, I'll be at Old North Church,
Ooh.
which is the meeting house that I go to when I manage to go. I'll be there on St. Patrick's Day, but at 2 in the afternoon. And
Okay.
there'll be books for sale from our brand new local independent bookstore, Saltwater Books.
Okay.
And so, if anyone wants to come and see me in person locally,
Hmm.
that will be open to the public. And I'll also be going to some book festivals. I'll be at the Nantucket Book Festival in June,
Mhm.
and I'll be at the Virginia Festival of the Book, and I'm going to Florida this coming weekend. So I'll be around and about. But I think the newest or the nearest in-person, actual honest to gosh in-person event is going to be at Old North in just a couple weeks.
Okay, I will put that in the recap email so everybody can consider going.
Okay,
So yeah,
that'd be
thank you
great.
so much for doing this. I
My
appreciate everybody who's
pleasure.
been here and asked your questions or just listened in. And I hope you all have a wonderful night. And if you do get a
Yeah,
chance to look for treasure, whatever that treasure is, I hope
wherever
you're
the treasure may
successful.
be. Yeah.
That's
And
right.
remember, we only drink wine when we run out of rum.
Something to live by.
Yes.
Good night,
Thank you
everybody.
so much, Mina.
You're welcome.
Good night.
Bye.